All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the office hour today to discuss the updated conservation, or excuse me, cover crop practice in AdCap 50. Just some quick background here. We had kicked off the rule revision process for AtCat 50 back in 2021, spent about 30 months drafting and taking the rule through public review and the other various administrative steps required by the state, and are excited to have recently published the updated rule back in June, so it is now fully promulgated. One of the exciting changes in AtCat 50 is the new and updated conservation practices that the rule provides. And the goal here really is to create more tools for you, the counties, to have at your disposal to address local priorities and local resource concerns. This was a concept we had heard very strong support for when we were doing our listening sessions back in fall of 2020 ahead of the rule revision. And we're talking about nutrient management and expanding the impact of SEG dollars. So these are very exciting changes, but also quite significant changes in how swarm cost share has been delivered in the past. Specifically, it will require a bit more from a planning standpoint, just ensuring steps are being hit at appropriate times and that there's adherence to standards and such. But it is a new world for us, but really the goal for today is to answer questions that you have, to capture any questions you have that we may not have yet considered, and then also capture any concerns that you may have regarding practice implementation. And the goal here also is just to make sure that we can provide you with the most helpful resources possible for implementation. So as far as the agenda goes for today, the Swarm team's going to kick it off with just an introduction on some of the web resources for the updated AtCat 50 practices. Uh, Randy is going to dive into just a brief introduction on kind of soil health systems and how the practice can fit into a soil health system. Cody's going to talk a bit about some of the technical resources that are available, and then the Swarm team will wrap up with providing information on some of the obligations for these updated practices. And then we should have ample time left at the end for question and answer.
Y'all, I'm gonna do mine first because I have to run to another training.
Sure, absolutely, Randy. We will kick it off with Randy and then jump to the web resources then.
Thanks. Sorry about that, Susan and Haley. Um, I'll just quickly share here. So as Mark pointed out, the new practices in AdCap 50 were designed to give you more resources available to address local concerns. And they really from itself isn't really a practice, but it's a principle. It's a systems thinking principle set. And the tools that we look at with these will help kind of build back to that system thinking. So if we look at that whole system of what is a soil, being a vital living ecosystem, more than just the unconsolidated components of the Earth's surface, but this vital living ecosystem. Soil health helps us build the functions of soil. NRCS gives us 5 here. These are on our website. You can go take a look at those. But a big one and a big problem, as we all know in Wisconsin, is that we've really damaged our water cycle in a lot of the ways that we've handled this. And what we're trying to do is build back these systems in having a soil health management system. With cover crops, we might focus in a little bit on some of the principles like maximizing soil cover and maximizing living roots and this diversifying the cropping system. But keeping in mind that this all fits back in the whole systems thinking is what we're really trying to do, build that adaptability through these practices and a systems thinking approach. All right, if I drop was the introduction to soil health training that we've developed and is out there. So those resources, soil health components or how to wrap that into your thinking and working. Be glad to talk to you about that another time. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Mark, and the rest of the team. Mark, you're muted.
Thank you. You'd figure after 4 years we'd get the hang of that.
Ever? Yeah, wait there. All right.
Thank you, Randy. All right, I'll kick it over to the SWRM team now to talk about some of the available web resources for the ADCAP 50 updates.
Great, thanks, Mark. I have brought up on the screen, you should see the ADCAP 50 homepage within the DATCAP website. On this webpage, you will have lots of information about the rule revision and what standards have been brought into it, along with links to all the programs that are referenced in ADCAP 50 if you need to look for more specific information. We also have buttons up here that will take you to several different places if you want to look at the details in the revisions or an FAQ. Or you can click on the practice specific information, and you'll find here at the top a list of all the new practices. Whatever practices have been updated. We even have a definitions and additional consideration links. So today we're going to be talking about cover crops. So if you come down here, it'll just give you a basic overview of changes that have been made, things to consider when putting it in, and a link to the 50 directly language if you would like to look at that. And on this page, after each practice, you have a return to the top of the page. So you can come back up and search for the next thing that you're interested in. And we also have here on the right side of the screen, all the new practices listed, along with who in DATCAP you should contact if you have questions specifically about those practices. So that's all I wanted to highlight right now. Feel free to click around on the DATCAP webpage and find all the new information that is out there. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Susan, and thanks to all the folks that put the time and effort into creating that document. I know it was a lot of work, so much appreciated. Excellent. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Cody now to talk a bit about some of the technical aspects of the new practice.
All right, thank you. Yeah, we're just going to cover the kind of the standard today. If you're, a lot of you have done cover crops for decades or for a very long time, so you don't really need a really deep primer into what cover crops are. But for reference, for new staff especially, we follow the NRCS conservation practice standard for cover crops. That is CPS 340. So we're talking about close growing grasses, legumes, broadleaves, and small grains for soil erosion, for soil health, enhancing water quality, and things like that. If you want, you can click on that link, or we'll put it in the chat. That'll take you directly to the field office tech guide where you can review the standard. So when we're talking about the standard, we're talking about, the criteria that you need to follow for implementing these practices. And that's not just for cover crops, but for cover crops in particular, we're talking about the general criteria that's at the top of the page. This is that minimum what you need to do to make sure that you're following that practice standard. We're talking about looking and reviewing the Tech Note 7 for species, seeding, and other methods. You can use non-certified seed, but it has to have 85% germination, things like that. These are the minimum requirements when you're looking at cover crops, when you're planning them. This is what you have to have at minimum to follow. But then there's additional criteria for specific resource concerns that if you're going to address, soil loss or water quality resource concerns, you'll need to go down to those specific additional criteria and make sure you're meeting those. When we're talking about soil loss, you're meeting T, or putting in cover crops that address tolerable soil loss and you have enough biomass for things like that. So when we're talking about cover crops, this is the standard we're following that is required for compliance with ATCP 50.68. So what we did this last year with the revision is that we added additional options for you when you're planting cover crops to, have different cost share rates based on whether it's single species or multi-species. And within that single species, you can provide additional cost share where termination is required or not required. When we're talking about termination, we really mean mechanical or chemical methods. We're not talking about winter kill, and we don't consider grazing or haying sufficient enough to terminate that cover crop for that cost share rate. And then again, for single species, if they're not on the list on the right, that's when you would provide that lower cost share rate, because anything that doesn't fall on that rate typically won't survive the winter. It'll winter kill. It won't be there in the spring. You don't need to provide additional funding for chemical or mechanical treatment of that cover crop. You know, things like oats or peas. But if there are species that you're working with producers on that do overwinter that don't fall on this list, let me know. This is just a list that we pulled from the NRCS cookbook for the last fiscal year. But if there are species that you're working on that don't fall on that list, let me know. We can make sure that they're incorporated. And then again, if you have any mixes that are 2 or more species, that's when you're allowed to provide up to that $75 an acre. And then again, just some additional tools and resources for planning purposes. Like I mentioned, we reference heavily the tech note in the guidance document, tech note 7. This is where you'll go for additional species descriptions, how to develop a mix, and those planting rates and planting dates. And specifically with those rates and dates, you must comply with those minimum seeding rates and planting dates for swarm funding. And then again, if you would like, there's an optional seeding calculator that helps you with some planning and documentation. And then for outside resources, not directly referenced by the practice standard, I recommend, going to the Midwest Cover Crop Council website. They have some tools there to help you, select which cover crops you're interested in for what purposes. They even have some sample mixes. It's pretty limited for Wisconsin for a couple recommendations after corn silage. But then they also have other trainings available on that webpage. So if you guys have any technical questions or would like someone to review, your mixes or things like that, I can provide a little bit of guidance, but typically I'll probably have you go to your area resource conservationist, or I'll rope in like Mike Stanek, the NRCS state agronomist, for additional questions, just to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page in making sure that we're implementing the standard according to the standard. So I see that Amy mentioned the variances and things like that in the chat. There's a little bit different process for how we do variances and waivers, and we probably won't be getting into too much detail today. So you must meet the planting rates and dates to be compliant with this standard. We will not be giving any waivers or anything like that outside of those dates. And with that, I can turn it over back to Susan to go into more on some of the contracting side of cover crops.
Okay. I had some slides, but I think I'm going to wing it with just taking you again to the webpage. This is the SWARM Grant Program for Counties webpage and the SWARM Grant resources. The first thing I want to talk about, you would find under section 3, forms and data sheets, and we're going to be looking at the cost share contract. And most of you are incredibly familiar with this document. There were just a couple of changes to it. First on page 3, this is where we used to have, sorry, my phone is ringing. How strange. Used to have a place for initials for landowners to initial the ongoing continuing compliance. We have moved that to page 5, section 3. So now I'm highlighting that as a difference, and it says to check the box in section 3 to confirm. So here on page 5 or section 3, we have the continuing compliance statements. This states that the landowner acknowledges receipt of a notice provided by the county explaining continuing compliance requirements arising out of the specific conservation practice. This is only really going to apply in terms of cover crops for when you are terminating the cover crop. As you all know, SWARM has 1-year contracts, and we are a reimbursement program. So typically we would require a practice to be fully implemented before paying a reimbursement on it. To attempt to facilitate administration on both the county side and on DATCP side, we are going to allow instead allowing for statements acknowledging ongoing actions needed to complete the practice. So that's what you'll find here. And we have a list of the practices it applies to. So 50.68 plus termination is one of them. Also, you'll see when we have the drop-down boxes, we're asking you to enter in the different numeral for the different types of cover crops. So single cover crops plus termination is going to be 50.68 sub 1. Cover crops, just a single one. This is what we've typically just had in the classes. Cover crops will be 50.68 sub 2, and multi-species cover crops will be 50.68 sub 3. So the next thing I want to take you to is the reimbursement form. Another form that you're all very familiar with, and it has not changed that much. You will see in the dropdown that there are some 68, 68.1, 68.2, and 68.3. So choose the one that you're going to be cost sharing on. And then we have added a section for non-engineered practices and multi-year cropping practices. So this is basically where the county is going to say, we provided the landowner with the information that is required for ongoing practices. We've reviewed what's going to be going on, and we agree that the ongoing maintenance and compliance activities are correct and necessary to meet the purpose of the practice. Something else that we have created, another form, because we're government and we like forms, is a certification for non-engineering practices. This is an optional form. You do not have to submit this for reimbursement. It's more of a tool for the counties to work through some of these new practices. So you'll have cover crops with termination is one of the ones that you see listed on here. You can talk about what resources being addressed. Third column doesn't apply to the cover crops. And then in the cover crop termination method, it has different options for termination. So this is a place you can set all this out. You can put general ideas for monitoring plans with methods, dates, planned monitoring. We have a place for the landowner to sign saying they understand this and they understand the operation and maintenance going forward was required. And the county certifying said, yep, this is what is needed to meet the purpose of this practice. Again, this is something just for the counties to use at this point in time. It is not going to be required as part of the reimbursement. And I think that is all I wanted to go over. So that's just the basic details of the updates to the forms regarding the cover cropping.
Excellent. Thank you, Susan. Yeah, and the last thing I wanted to mention is before we can turn this over for question and answer is just we do try and create some flexibility here. Just a reminder to the counties, those are maximum rates that were provided in ATCAT 50. So if you want to de-emphasize single species cover crops, for example, or if you want to require that an overwintering species is put into a multi-species cover crop mix, you have those flexibilities to kind of tailor this practice to your local priorities and resource concerns. So I did just want to mention that. Excellent. Well, let's use the remainder of the time here to open it up for question and answer. Feel free to type questions into the chat or unmute if you're comfortable with that. Question from Linda in the chat. If someone's already signed a contract on the old form, do we need to redo the contract with the new form, Susan?
A good question, Linda. No, we're not requesting that at this point in time. We are going to probably choose on January 1st as a hard date to start using the new forms, but for now, we'll just keep moving as we are.
I'll maybe just really quickly touch on Amy's message from before about variances. The tricky part for us, Amy, is there's a whole separate waiver process through ATCAT 50 that is, it's got to be done every time. So on a case by case basis, you can't provide blanket waivers, and we don't have technical staff that are authorized to approve waivers. It's got to go all the way up through our secretary's office. So it becomes a very difficult process to to try and navigate waivers for swarm contracts, just given the administrative requirements on our ends. Fred had a question. Wouldn't we want overwintering single species? Just, maybe I misheard the conversation. Yes, Fred. So there's a couple different options. You can do a single species that is non-overwintering, so would not require termination, and that's the lowest rate. There is an overwintering single species that would require termination. That's the middle rate, and then the multi-species was the highest rate.
I also, and just throw in there, going kind of back to Linda's contracting question. If you have already signed a contract for just cover crops this fall, or even over the summer, if you signed a contract for just 58.68 as it used to be, you can use a change order to change it to one of these other practices and increase the rate, if you so desire. So any questions about that, just send me an email.
Scott had a question. When should the cost share payments be made, and what if the operator does not terminate the cover crop?
Yeah, that's one of the what ifs that we've been playing around with. If you are contracting and wanting to pay for the cover crops with termination, if everyone has agreed to the continuing compliance as provided on the contract and the reimbursement form, you can pay ahead of termination. If you pay ahead of termination and then termination for whatever reason does not occur, you can, as the county, request the landowner to pay you back. And yes, counties still have the option to cost share at a lower rate. Rick. Okay, Fred is asking if we're required to use the different rates. No, you're not. You can cost share as you have always done if you choose to. These are maximum rates that you're allowed to use if you so choose, but there's nothing forcing you to.
The one thing I'd maybe add to that is we probably wouldn't want to create a situation where we're incentivizing like a non-overwintering single species above a wintering or multi-species, but you definitely can go below that rate. So if you want to set those own limits locally, yep, absolutely. We would probably just ask, don't the way we've prioritized them with the different funding levels, don't reprioritize them basically, if you're going to offer multiple cover crop options. Any other questions?
Could you maybe just go through the new contract at the end and just a couple scenarios for folks, say single species cereal rye, multi-species with particularly with those two new check boxes, just to demonstrate to everyone how it should be filled out for future years?
Absolutely. Susan, do you want to bring that document back up?
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, this is page 5 of the contract. Um, again, we're just going to be looking at the continuing compliance statements for cover crops with termination. Basically, we're asking the counties to work with the landowner to come up with continuing compliance ideas, thoughts, plans. Let's go with plans. That's the best word. And formalize that so that the landowner can check the box saying, yes, I've received this notice or plan from the county explaining the continuing compliance requirements. And then the lower box, continuing compliance schedule set by the county, that's basically saying, yes, the county has done this and it's been reviewed by the landowner for those specific practices. Again, this is just dealing with cover crops for cereal species cover crops with termination. In terms of what the species are that are being planted or the specifics of that, we're not asking that question for reimbursement. We toyed with that because I think it would be interesting information to collect and to have, but we decided not to go that path at this point in time. So this is really just coming down to what's being planted, how it's going to be terminated, when is it going to be terminated, and everybody's on the same page and understands what the plan is. Does that help, Matt?
Yeah, I think so. So if we know there's a species that doesn't need termination or mixed species, then these boxes do not need to be checked. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yep, that is correct.
Okay. But something like a cereal rye, the discussion needs to happen.
Yes.
And both boxes checked. Okay.
Yep, exactly.
All right. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yep.
There's a question from Amy. Can you clarify the amount of seg funds that can be used for nutrient management versus practices that are implementing nutrient management? That information you will find in the instruction document or RFP that comes out for the seg application in January of every year. For 2024, I misspoke on this at our last meeting. For 2024, it's up to 50% of your seg allocation can be used on any practices or cropping practices to support a nutrient management plan. There is a potential to use seg funds up to 50% on bondable or structural practices, I guess I should say, in support of a nutrient management plan. That requires pre-approval from DATCP still at this point in time. In the 2025 application that we're just getting the allocation plan out next month for, in October, that 50% has been removed from the percent of seg that can be used on cropping practices. It's been left completely open to the county, of course, with the stipulation that a nutrient management checklist is required for reimbursement on any of those practices. And I'm going to, while I have my webpage or my screen shared, I'm going to go back here. In section 2 of our grant resources, you'll find policies and procedures. Document 2.2 is something we internally refer to all the time. It has a list of every practice, the type of funding source, the measurements asked for when you're reimbursing, or when you're contracting, I should say. And you'll see the green highlighted practices. Those are set or bond or structural practices that you can use seg funds for with pre-approval. So that'll be highlighted in green, or practices you can use seg funds for. The next on this document is the NR 151 codes and how they apply to different practices. So there are some practices that only can be cost shared at 50% unless you're meeting an NR 151 compliance goal. So that is on there. And we also have added a table with these flat rates. So here for the cover crops, you'll see the 65 or 60, 35, and 75 cover crops. This is a document, again, we refer to all the time in-house. I highly recommend you become familiar with it. It's very helpful.
Susan, Amy had also asked about the contract online, which was not matching the one you were sharing. Did you want to touch on that real quick?
Yes, we just updated that a couple of, or I guess it was last week maybe, but I'll go back and double check that it's actually, I opened it from this link. So the one that I opened is the one that is online now, but that
Okay.
is a fairly recent update.
I was just going to say that the language is slightly different in the box is on the one that I'm downloading right now. So
Okay,
just
I will
wanted-
double check that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, the second box has slightly different language.
Okay. I will double check that. Thanks, Amy.
Cody, a question for you. What are the dates and rates?
Yeah, let me share my screen here. They're in Tech Note 7 on on a couple of last pages. You'll see a lot of tables. That's where they'll list the minimum seating rates, and then they'll also give you the range of windows. I'm just trying to find I just had it up here. Share this screen. And I apologize. The one that I sent in the initially, that's to the guidance document, but NRCS also copies all of the tables into the guidance document. So this is the Tech Note 7. This is what we're referring to. If you go all the way down to the back here, you can see information on specific species, and then you go all the way down. These are the tables that we're referring to for minimum seating rates, whether it's incorporated or non-incorporated. It's like broadcast. And then the seating date. So these are really important that you're within these windows for compliance with the standard. And then if you want to, if you're doing a little bit of planning and you want to know whether the cover crop that you're planting is a good nitrogen source or nitrogen scavenger, there's that table down here with this conservation effects table. So I recommend looking at that if you're kind of new to cover crops and trying to figure out which ones are, at least in this update, good at specific and have specific benefits. So.
Cody, apologies if you touched on this. Could you talk about where folks could find the list of overwintering species in our resources and NRCS's as well, please?
The overwintering list specifically comes out of the cookbook, which is NRCS's kind of policy document for EQIP and CSP. So they listed them in there, and that's where we pulled them from. They don't list them necessarily in the tech note or the guidance document, but I was reading some language. Let's see. Yeah, it doesn't really tell you in here whether it's whether it's an overwintering one or not. But that's where we'll have to put the list of those overwintering species on our guidance documents and on the webpage for reference. And that's kind of where if like you guys are working with some newer or more innovative cover crops that do overwinter, I can just chat with like Mike Stanek if that's something consistent with like EQIP or CSP, and then we can include that on our list. So we can be flexible that way. We're not going to incorporate that list in like ACCAP 50 because then we'll be stuck with a list of species that needs to be updated once in a while. So if it's not listed in this tech note and it's something the like NRCS is working on, just let me know because I talk with Mike Stanek pretty frequently. So. Table for reference again.
Any other questions out there? If not, I think DADCAP staff will stay on for a few minutes after the call too, just in case folks do want to chat one-on-one or have any questions that you would wanted to discuss. So we'll give one last call for questions here. Otherwise, we'll let folks go and again, direct you to our online resources, which were shared in the chat. There's some good resources. If as you're reviewing those materials, new questions come up, all of the staff and their specific topics are listed on the side with their contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out and ask your questions. We're here to help. And if there's no other questions, thanks for joining. I hope you have a good day.